Views expressed in this podcast belong solely to Brown Girl Health team members. This podcast is for entertainment purposes only and is not intended to discriminate against anyone. Hi everyone, welcome to the second episode of the Brown Girl Health podcast. My name is Shivani.
My name is Ameek.
And we are the hosts of this podcast. I would like to encourage you all to join the Brown Girl Health community by following us on Instagram at brown.girl.health and Twitter at bghtweets and subscribing to our YouTube channel. Their links are in the description as well.
In today's episode, Shivani and I will be talking about Kamala Harris and what her election as Vice President of the United States means to the South Asian community and brown women in the U.S. Today we're joined by Dhwani, one of our other members and head of our research team. We're going to be excited to share some of our views on VP Harris's inauguration earlier this year.
Hi everyone, I'm Dhwani, and I'm super excited to join you guys today. For me, Kamala Harris's inauguration feels especially important because she's a woman of color, and particularly one with a South Asian background, holding one of the most powerful positions in government.
Although we've heard a lot about Kamala Harris over the last couple of months, there were still a lot of things that I personally didn't know about her until I started doing research for this episode. So maybe to start off, we can talk a little bit about Kamala Harris, her background, and other accomplishments prior to becoming VP of the United States.
So it's really interesting because Kamala Harris is from Oakland, California, and the reason why she was there is because her mother, Shamala, was a biologist that was a professor at UC Berkeley and a researcher there. And I'm a Berkeley alum, so I guess go Bears. But I find that really interesting because she was a breast cancer researcher, and I think that really ties in with the whole brown girl health thing, just a little connection right there. And I don't know, I guess one other thing about her background that really surprised me was when at the debate that she had last year when she was running for office, it was against Biden, and there was this whole thing with the busing system. And people were really surprised that she really stood up out there and talked and kind of questioned him on his stance with the whole busing system. So that was really interesting. And then there's also the whole thing about her background where she's African American and also South Asian, and she herself proclaims as she's just American, and I think that's really commendable as well and really important stance to make.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think it's so easy to get caught up in her heritage and her background that we sometimes forget that she's American, and that's the most important part of her identity in terms of being VP of the United States. And I think everything that she's done is so commendable. And like you were saying, when she stood up at the debate, I think it just goes to show that even now, women are not necessarily allowed to, or they're not given the freedom to express their views in the ways that many men are able to do. And so I guess a lot of people, and I hate to say it, but a lot of people were shocked to even see her stand up for herself and speak her voice out in her campaign.
Absolutely. I mean, do you remember I think it was during the VP debate, people were still trying to speak over her and silence her and not letting her express her ideas as she was a vice presidential candidate.
Oh yeah, my favorite quote was when she was like, "Mr. Vice President, I'm speaking." And that became a whole meme, and then it became this whole community of people who were standing up and sharing their stories about when they were silenced. And it's so empowering to see that. We would never have been able to see something like that in a campaign before because women weren't even really given that opportunity, to run for vice president. And even if they were, they didn't really go too far in the race. So it's very, very inspiring.
That was honestly the best moment of that night. I remember just her saying that was she has a voice, and that's an important voice. And it just, that, 2 words, "I'm speaking," was very powerful in that sense. So I'm really, I remember coming out of that and being wow. And I'm sure a lot of listeners can relate to this as well.
But at the same time, it's 2021. It's not great that she even had to say that in the first place.
We always think that we've made so much progress in our country and that things like this shouldn't be allowed anymore. But clearly there's been so much backlash coming from so many people within our country. And it just makes me think that maybe we haven't reached the point that we think we've reached. And it's probably going to take some more time. And this is just a stepping stone in the right direction. So hopefully by the end of her term, she does receive more support than she did during her campaign.
Yeah, that's completely fair. And I mean, personally, I don't necessarily agree with all of her policies. Like, there have been points in the past which I've definitely disagreed with, but at the same time, it's undeniable that she's faced so much more sexism and racism from the public than many other candidates did. So it was harder for her to get to where she is. And then there's this quote where I think it's like her mother told her, like, you may be the first to do things, but you shouldn't be the last. And from being a South Asian woman of South Asian descent in America, hearing something like this is empowering, because not only do you want to get to these places, but you want to be able to open opportunities up for other people who have similar identities and who are not necessarily put in these places where they can easily get to places like this. And being vice president of the United States with such an amazing identity and such a different background than traditional presidents have been, it took 2.5 centuries for a woman to be here. And now that she's here and she's a woman of color, I'm very much empowered by that. And being a university student, I'm sure both of you also kind of agree in that sense that now we're at this place where we're finding what paths that we want to pursue, and we shouldn't feel limited by anything, because if she can do it, she's going to open up these opportunities for us as well, and so she won't be the last.
And I was thinking about this the other day, but it's so crazy that in a couple of generations, kids who are going to be born this year, they'll never have lived in a country where a female vice president wasn't possible. And for us growing up, it was always kind of like, we thought that there was like white men in place in this position, and that kind of changed with President Obama back in 2008. But now all of a sudden we see someone who looks like us as vice president. And I think it's going to be a huge change in the way that future generations see our country and our government administration.
Absolutely. But I also think it's going to take a lot more than just having one person in that position of power to cause that change. I mean, like, as Ameek was saying, like, she isn't perfect and definitely deserves criticism. Like, politicians should be held to a higher standard, but I think a lot of her critics are so much more vocal than they would be if she were like a white woman or a white man. And it's like absolutely ridiculous that we finally get to this place where we have a non-white man as our vice president, and they're still facing so much more trouble getting their voice heard.
And what's really surprising to me is that people are still having a hard time wrapping their heads around it. Like, we all knew this would be a possibility, that she would become VP, and now that she's VP, people are still so hesitant to accept her in this position, which is just very crazy to me.
I mean, to be fair, part of me still can't believe she's our VP, but like for completely different reasons. Like growing up, our exposure to South Asians were like limited to just like the nerdy characters on TV, or like Baljeet on Phineas and Ferb. So to see someone named like Kamala Devi Harris gaining respect and holding a title like VP of the United States, it really does mean a lot to my younger self, but it's also like every time I think about it, I'm still a little bit shocked.
Yeah, and to just go off of that, I think it's also so important for us to remember that she is a Black woman, and she, is an American, and that's not something we should forget. I definitely see like our South Asian community is trying to accept her more and like say she's South Asian, but there's definitely a different part of her identity that we must address.
I completely agree with that. I've seen a lot of South Asians ecstatic over her win. There were like so many memes. I think her mother's village in India like had some sort of offering for her. It was on the news. But there's still so much racism and colorism within the community, and I can't help but wonder if they ignore the fact that she's Black. And I also want to kind of think about, there's some people who, like, people outside of the South Asian community, how do they perceive her? Because I found this really interesting quote, and it was by a professor at Rutgers University, and it was like someone who like specializes in this sort of stuff. It was something along the lines of, though that she's like this person with a very like complicated, different sort of identity, there's this tendency that a lot of people see the African American part about it, and then they think about like the hierarchy of races, and then they'll choose the one that's perceived lower in society and like associate her with that identity. So people have traditionally perceived her more as Black than South Asian. So I kind of am curious to see how is that perception still relevant now that she is vice president, and given that the South Asian community, mostly from what I've seen, associates her as mostly just South Asian. I think that's really interesting. And how has she leveraged the South Asian community with votes? Because she had this whole collaboration with like Mindy Kaling, and they were like making like dosa and like in an apartment talking about their Indian cultures. So there's this whole thing to like wrap your head around, like what do people like actually associate with her and why does that really matter?
I definitely agree. I think as a society as a whole, we have to acknowledge both parts of her identity. Like, she's not just Indian and she's not just Black. She is both, and she's American, and that is a very unique experience that has shaped a lot of who she is and a lot of what policies she'll be pushing and things like that. And you know, just to ignore half of her identity, regardless if like you associate her more with one than the other, like just to ignore the other half is just plain racist. Like, you can't do that. And as far as the South Asian community goes, like as you were saying, it's really interesting to see that they do only actually perceive her as South Asian. Like, there was this WhatsApp forward going around earlier this month, and like it was pretty bad. They basically attempted to criticize her achievements and by saying that she's mixed race and not fully Indian or whatever, and it was basically saying like our community shouldn't be embracing her because of that. Like, and that just completely, like, I was completely shocked that that kind of behavior is still being tolerated, especially with everything that happened in the past year.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think last year we saw the South Asian community really come out and support, you know, the protests that were happening and really stand up for the Black Lives Matter movement. But now all of a sudden we're kind of going back to this colorism that kind of exists in our society. And I really want to see how that does change with time. And I really hope that we don't focus on her race or her ethnicity as much and really think about what it means for her to be VP of our country and what she can do moving forward.
You know, interestingly enough, when I was doing some searching online, I found that the executive director of a very known nonprofit group, the South Asians Americans Leading Together, also known as SALT, they suggested that Harris's nomination, and I quote, is an opportunity to look at the issue of anti-Black racism in our community. The deeply seated anti-Black racism in the South Asian community is often not a welcoming place for those who identify as Black, and confronting that racism should be the priority of the South Asian American community right now, especially given the current movement to expose and eliminate police violence. And I think that really just ties into what you were just saying, Shivani, about like the Black Lives Matter movement, because we did see even celebrities in India were supporting like BLM, and they're not even, you know, from the country. So now that we're taking steps like this, how can we kind of take it to another level and like completely take it out? And I think along with that comes in ties of like complexionism, because I think especially like back in India, like Fair and Lovely is still a thing that sells a lot. They renamed the thing, but it's still like crazy, right? And like things like that are like very like kind of irrelevant to this, but also still very relevant because they're hints of what really Indians perceive like different complexions or darker complexions to be, and that ultimately also turns into like racism of sorts, especially when they immigrate to like America, for example.
Yeah, and I think that that just goes to show that the few months of protest and petition signing that happened last year isn't enough. We still definitely need to be putting in more work in our home and in our communities, plus having those tough conversations. I think it's so important. We need to educate ourselves and, you know, ask for help when we need it to understand some issues, but also really make sure that we're educating ourselves and those around us, and in order to ensure that our behavior towards this is being changed.
But having a woman, and particularly a woman of color, in her position, like there's still so much that she can advocate for, and like experiences that she can bring to the table, especially in terms of healthcare, which is, I think, something our page is particularly interested in.
Yeah, for sure. I think something that's already happened was like the moment Biden came into office, there was so many different not healthcare related, but so many different legislation, like just all changed, right? And a lot of it had to do with COVID-19, but specifically in terms of women's health, I think given that there is a woman who's the vice president of the United States now, there's so much scope for what can be done, because there's always been that argument, like women should be the ones to decide what's happening with their bodies, and it's always directed to the Supreme Court, and how majority of that court isn't necessarily like they aren't women, right? So that's really interesting. But I think what really like appealed to me recently is how there's a lot more progress on things like the Affordable Care Act. And I think being a woman of color and like being in that sort of position in a community that's most vulnerable to a lot of things, the Affordable Care Act has been so beneficial to people of minority communities. So it's really great to see that the Care Act covers more access to things like preventive care and contraceptives, as well as they also repealed the Hyde Amendment, which I thought was even more interesting because that blocks public funding for things like abortions under Medicaid, except for cases that involve rape, incest, or if the pregnancy threatens the mother's life. And this amendment used to be approved every year, and that's already something that kind of changes with this whole Biden-Harris being in office.
And it's about time that happened too. I mean, abortion was legalized in 1973, and it's taken so long for people to realize that it actually is a fundamental healthcare right for women to have safe access to abortion. And I think this administration is going to do a lot, not just in terms of that, but also just in healthcare in general, as you said, Ameek, just to make sure that everyone has access to it. Everyone, can get the care they need. They're not struggling to pay their bills and things like that. I actually have a lot of hope that this administration can do a lot to change the way the healthcare system is run in this country, because I think that is a problem. It is a problem, and I think people on both sides of the aisle can agree with that. So I'm looking forward to see what they do.
Because it's not necessarily just a political question of pro-life and pro-choice. It's also safety of women, because there was a research study that I recently read, and it was something along the lines of women who are denied abortions, they tend to have poor mental health, poor finances in general, and their emotional health is really affected because now they have this child and they are not properly equipped to take care of the child, and there's a lot of things that come out with that. And then there's also this idea of just finances in general. There's the global gag rule, which was just rescinded as well with the Biden-Harris presidency. And that's talking about how any health organization around the world doesn't get as much funding if they provide services related to abortions. But now that gag rule is rescinded, now these organizations are not affected with their overall funding with abortions. So that's really interesting. So economically, what are these changes? What are the effects of these changes?
Oh, absolutely. I completely agree that it does have a huge impact in not just healthcare, but in all sorts of sectors. And I think it's really good that they are taking steps to address this, because healthcare inequality is bad in America, but in other countries it could be worse. And healthcare nonprofits that do work in areas that need the help, it's just not fair to withhold funds from them, because they're providing what is essentially a necessary medical service. And it's not even, I know this is backed up by research, but just common sense says that if people don't have safe access to abortions, right, they're going to find a way to have one anyway, and that can just lead to maternal mortality and all kinds of unsafe procedures, bribery. It can just put so many more people's lives in danger, and it just makes a lot more sense to, couple easy access to this type of healthcare along with education and things, to make sure that people are making responsible decisions for them. And if that's having an abortion, it's having an abortion. If it's carrying the child to term, it's doing that. And we need to support people in whatever choice they make. And I do think this administration will be taking steps to do that, but I also am interested to see how and what they prioritize.
No, and I think even just, getting back out of women's health and abortions and all of that, I think something really important and noteworthy is this idea of accessibility for healthcare, right? And making sure that every community is able to get whatever they need to have good health. And one thing with Vice President Harris is that she co-sponsored Bernie Sanders' bill in 2017, which was Medicare for All. So she was one of the first Democrats to sign onto the single-payer bill, which I think is very interesting. It shows a lot about her stance in wanting to commit to get healthcare to all these people. And then she also, in the presidential primary, she initially doubled down on the idea of eliminating private health insurance, but then she later backtracked from that, so that's very interesting. But she also had a plan that called to shift for an expanded Medicare system over a 10-year period. So there's just all of this stuff, and especially with Medicare, like, these are all very complicated topics, and all these politicians have so many different stances for it. But I think something really nice about her stance is that she's committing to just wanting to get important health care, or good health care to any sort of community, which is important.
While I agree with that, it is a warning sign to me that she has changed her mind on, like, she has that big general position, but she has changed her mind on, like, going from Medicare to all, to, like, not eliminating private insurances, so on and so forth. And it, she's a politician. That is her profession. And politicians, they do their job by networking, by making compromises and things. But I think as people who she is serving, it is up to us to hold her accountable to these things, and making sure that they're not compromising on things that can be detrimental, whatever your stance on that is, right? And so it is a little bit of a red flag to me that she has changed her position on that. But I also agree, and I think generally this administration will move things to a better position. It's just how far are they willing to go?
For sure. And I just wanted to add, like, I 100% agree with what you mean with the politicians and the backtracking and all the wishy-washy stuff, especially with healthcare. But I have to say, I think my most favorite thing about Kamala Harris and what she's done with healthcare is addressing the social determinants of health, and, like, policies that address, like, public health specifically, because that really ties into accessibility of health. And what I'm referring to is that this kind of goes back into what we were previously talking about with her identity and all of that. But a fact is that the maternal mortality crisis in the U.S. has left Black women 3 times as likely to die from complications of pregnancy than white women. And Vice President Harris at some point called for investments to address this. She and other members of the Black Maternal Health Caucus introduced the Black Maternal Health Omnibus Act, which makes investments in social determinants of health, community-based organizations, and the growth and diversification of the perinatal workforce. So just putting in these investments as a politician just goes to show that she really does care about specific things like this. And this ties into women's health, ties into equity, health equity, and I really commend her for that. And I think just reading that earlier made me very, happy to see that woman like this is in office, because this is kind of like a sign with that whole thing that we had earlier, that she might be the first to get to this pedestal, but now, like, being able to use that to help her own, like, to help certain communities in general just means a lot.
Definitely. And in terms of, like, social determinants of health, I actually took a class about this, like, about maternal and infant mortality, and it was so interesting to see the reason why we have all of these disparities in healthcare. And I think the biggest one is there's already this, like, institutional racism that exists within our country, and a lot of people are actually scared to go to doctors and reach out to get that help because of the way that they've been treated in the past and their ancestors have been treated in the past. And hopefully by seeing someone like her in office, people can feel more comfortable about seeking help, especially with healthcare. And I just think that's something that's really important.
Going off of her public health record, I absolutely agree. I'm glad she's taking steps to address inequalities and blatant discrimination that should be completely unacceptable within the system. However, we can't, solely praise that without addressing other parts of her record, which includes her work with communities of color in other ways, economically, socially. She was DA and then AG of California for a while, and a lot of people are completely turned off by that because of the policies she upheld while in that position, like increasing the incarceration rate or certain cases her office prosecuted. So while some might be more trustful of the healthcare system, knowing that someone is probably working within it to make sure things are equitable and advocating for them, others from those exact same communities may very well not be, and frankly, they have every right to be distrustful. And I definitely think, even from a medical perspective, we absolutely do have to hold her accountable to those things, because it's not just a hospital or medical setting that affects healthcare, all kinds of factors affect it, like your race, your socioeconomic status, the environment you live in. All of these things contribute to how you interact with the world, and more importantly, how they perceive you. And in the case of like healthcare specifically, it affects to what extent they're going to take you seriously and give you the care you need. It's all tied up together, so it's super important that we advocate for changes in all parts of society.
So I think something really interesting, and I think that I can't really avoid when it comes to Kamala Harris, is being a Sikh and being part of the Sikh community. There was an instance where when she was working in California as Attorney General, she had a little bit of a troubled history with like criminal justice and civil rights, and specifically to the Sikh community, which is part of, the South Asian conglomeration. Was her not allowing someone to keep his articles of faith when it came to getting a certain job. There was a job that required gas mask fitting, and part of the Sikh community is that you have to keep facial hair, and you can't. She was trying to mandate that you have to completely shave it off in order to like do this job, and that's really a infringement of this idea of like freedom of religion, and something especially after 9/11 when this happened was something that was already grappling with like the Sikh community and other South Asian communities too, because they were all in this place of a lot of like hate crimes were occurring, and a lot of racism had like kind of peaked right after 9/11, especially against an Indian community as well. So there was that, and it just reeked of discrimination, and it was alarming to read something of like that. This is before she even ran for president when I read this, but that was interesting, and that happened when she was Attorney General. But now that she is vice president, I think that it's important to reiterate that no one in America should have to make a decision between like practicing their faith and like having like a job. And like as someone who has such a unique background and heritage as her, she is in this position where she can make like certain decisions that can affect communities like this. And she probably has a sort of humility when it comes to approaching topics like these. But in order to like change up things, because like we said before, she's not perfect, and that's absolutely fine. But in general, for South Asians, my hope is that like more South Asians, and specifically my own community, really have more amplified voice when it comes to political decisions like these, and even women in general. And she's really a step up to getting like, that voice to help guide these decisions. But it's important that we start taking up more space at like this decision making table, and like do more than just be there and like amplify and like keep on amplifying. And with that, a lot more difference can be made.
Like, I completely agree with you, Ameek, but I definitely am a strong believer in the fact that representation is good only if the people we are heralding as representation are putting in the work to uplift the communities that they are from. And I'm not saying that she hasn't done that, but as you said, there are shortcomings, and we do have to hold her accountable for that.
I think despite the shortcomings, though, it's great to know that, she's there. And because she's there, she's in this unique position, and she can make all these legislative changes. And she kind of has with the maternal health and Black women. And she has really made this effort to reach out to the South Asian community when she was in that Mindy Kaling video, or even in general when she talks about her mother and like going to India. And there's all this stuff that really like kind of shows that her heritage really is been a guiding point for her when she's made these decisions. And I think having such an amazing and unique background like that is still like a place with a lot of positivity and a lot of potential out there. So I'm very excited to see how these next 4 years go when she's in office, and maybe even longer.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I'm definitely looking forward to seeing what she does. I do have high hopes for her and the Biden administration in general, and I think there's a lot of potential for good work here.
Thank you so much, Dhwani, for being on our episode today. It was great talking to you, and we really hope to see you on future episodes. And so I just want to end off this episode with a quote from Kamala Harris, and I hope you guys will all keep this in mind in your future endeavors. But what she said was, "What I want young women and girls to know is you are powerful and your voice matters."